Greetings, everyone. I am delighted today to be interviewing and in conversation with Irene Chong, who we've been in conversation before, and now I'm getting the opportunity to interview you rather than you're interviewing me. So thank you for doing this today, Irene.
Oh, thank you, Heather, for having me.
So let me share a little bit about her background, and then I'll put your more full bio and link to your website below. But Irene was an educator in Singapore and reconfigured her life and her work, and is now the founder of Alignment Journeys, which is a program that's really supporting women in tapping into their intuition and wisdom and creativity to live from their true selves. And Irene is a gifted healer who works with a variety of modalities, a very gifted coach, and also does many workshops. And I really respect your work, Irene. And more than that, part of what I'd love to talk about today is your journey and how you came into doing this work and your own inner process around that transformation. Because some of what I really honor and respect about you is your own, the way in which you've been on your own journey of transformation and discovery to be living from your true self, which I think is what we're all being called into as we're in this Aquarian age. So it's really profound how you're in that ongoing process in your own journey and then supporting others and women in particular and how to be in their journeys. So let's start out by talking a little bit about how you made this shift from being on this path in Singapore that was really a very secure professional path with a lot of support to really shifting your trajectory to follow your own path that was true to your inner self.
Mm. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Heather, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for your kind words, and I'm very moved that you feel that way about me and my work. So, to answer your question, I would guess that it's really a universal story of wanting to self-actualize. And that was a term that I had come across when I was training to be an educator. So that idea of moving up this hierarchy of needs, which you may know the whole idea behind it when Maslow got his inspiration was from a society where he saw that it was the tribe, and I don't particularly specifically remember the name, but essentially it was about fulfilling your soul potential and your life's purpose. So I feel that very much in my younger years and all that I'd experienced, my childhood, my upbringing, the education system that I was in, the culture and the conditioning that I was placed under, was in some way nudging me. It was awakening me to recognize my path. So it wasn't, and I do believe in the heroine's journey, it isn't going to be smooth sailing. So I had my fair of challenges, obstacles, but it was always with, I believe now, the purpose and intent of guiding me towards what it is that in this life, my higher self or my soul, whatever language you wish to use, was nudging me very lovingly to actualize. So when I was young, and I think of the things that I was naturally drawn to, amongst the academic subjects that were available in the then school system, literature was the one that called most to me. And I think it spoke to a certain poetry that I was feeling in my soul. So I knew that from a young age that I wanted to always be on this path. And literature was the one that sparked that imagination and that, I suppose, that fertile poetic sense that I felt in my soul. And then along the way, as I came to broaden my horizons, I began my path on the sacred feminine. And there was no looking back ever since. So even though I trained, I got my qualifications and I became a teacher after I graduated from university, there was always a very strong calling. And I do believe that we live in a benevolent universe
Mm,
that had always been looking after
mm.
and making sure that I would be where I am today. And it was all about me just saying yes to the call. So in short, that's how I came to reconfigure my life and do what I'm doing now.
But I think part of what you're saying that's so important, Irene, is our being willing to say yes to the
Mm,
call and to that inner knowing of our higher self or soul self. When there's a lot of pressure from cultural expectations and the pressures around us to not listen to that call, but to be on a path that looks like it's the right path and the secure one. So that's part of what I respect about you is you've listened to that inner call. And say a little bit more about how you got interested in the sacred feminine and why that's so important to you and so important in your work now. And that's
mm,
something you and I are both very passionate about in terms of the importance of reweaving the sacred feminine to bring the sacred feminine and sacred masculine back into balance in this time as we're moving into the Aquarian age. But how did that become so important to you?
yeah. So I feel that there are two questions to in your question. So I'll answer the first part first. And I agree with you that it's difficult and challenging to listen to the calling because I faced that, right? Like I mentioned, it wasn't smooth sailing at all. I had a lot of resistance, a lot of conditioning as well. Um, and interestingly, one of the things that I learned when I was in education was that the evolutionary path that we are on is not to be constantly learning. We learn with the programming and the conditioning that we were just brought up in when we came into this world. And we do it very, very often unconsciously. And then we have to unlearn all the
Ah,
conditioning, all the
beautifully
programming.
said.
And then we embark on a journey of relearning, this time more consciously and intentionally taking on what it is that we want to believe in. What are the principles and values that we desire to live aligned to? So that was very much a process. And I think I shared this with you before that when I look back at my younger self, I don't recognize her at all.
Mm,
I used to be painfully shy. I was really good at hiding, putting on a performative mask, but making my true self, what I really thought and felt deep down inside, invisible to other people. And I became really good at it and not being found out.
mm,
So in my previous life, uh, as an academic and as an educator, uh, I was enjoying a lot of success in that profession, but there was always that strong inner calling, like when I was doing my own thing, which many of my colleagues didn't even know much about. Um, I always felt this push-pull. And as you know, Heather, I have a lot of polarities in my chart. So I was constantly feeling this sense of internal conflict that became very, I don't think dramatic is the right word, but it felt very intense and extreme. And it felt like the more I wanted to stay true to who I authentically am,
mm,
I had to let go of this hiding and masking, and I had to say yes. So I think it was really a result of just feeling at some point that I've had enough of leading a double life, that I wanted to be true to the core of who I am,
mm.
that I finally said yes. And when I did say yes, I didn't know how or why, or even what I was going to do. I would describe it as a total surrender to the mystery. But I just had to say yes because I couldn't say no anymore. I hope that makes sense. Um, and then to answer your second question about my interest in the sacred feminine. So as I shared earlier, from a very young age, I've always felt this knowing, but it was a knowing that I could not articulate. So earlier on, I also mentioned this process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. But I do feel that as souls, we come into this world and we come incarnated with already certain intrinsic qualities and values that our higher selves had chosen. And I believe that when I came into this life, I had it quite strongly inside of me. But it was very different from the world that I grew up in. So the learning that I unconsciously took on from my biological family, from the culture that I was brought up in, it was very different. And slowly, as I grew up from a child to a teenager to an adult, I began to forget some of it. I began to take on what was acceptable in society, which, as you know, is very much a toxic patriarchal model that I found myself excelling in, but then I felt that it was also lacking in a lot of things that I intrinsically in my soul knew needs to be there. So there was this remembrance of the past. And I know you speak a lot about the age of Taurus, about 5,000 years ago. And I remember when we had a conversation, I shared that I resonate a lot with it because there was a very strong remembrance of a time when things were different. And I feel that the path that I'm on right now is not so much a desire to return to the past. Rather, I see a lot of I feel that I carry a lot of information on a soul level of the past that I wish to reinterpret for the current context that we are in, because we are living in a very different age, a very different world right now, that I feel has forgotten and neglected a lot of what was of value in the past. So I feel that my desire, my mission to bring back the sacred feminine has to do with, I guess I would call it a creative reinterpretation of what would work now, what would most serve the current collective. And especially I feel that it's the rise of women specifically, or the rise of the sacred feminine in men as well. But I've spoken about this before, where I shared that as a woman coming incarnated, I feel most strongly called to serve women. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, this is beautiful, Irene. And I'm really struck by a couple of things in what you're saying. One is that willingness to step into the path of being in alignment. And it's interesting, your work is alignment journeys. It's really about being in alignment with your true self, with your soul self. But that when we say yes to that, it is often stepping into the mystery, stepping into the unknown. It's about daring to be different. We've talked about how you have Eris Xena in your first house. But it's also about being willing, as you're saying, to unlearn what we've been conditioned with, to really be listening to that inner knowing, following that inner path. And that's part of what I really respect in you, is that courage to step into that mystery, to trust and follow your inner path. And I also really, I love what you were saying about how many of us have incarnated in this time to bring some of that ancient wisdom back into the consciousness in the world now. But it isn't about going back into the past. It's how do we reweave that in a new way as we're moving into these new paradigms of the Aquarian age. And say a little bit more about how you're doing that in your work, because you're actively supporting women in particular in how they're reconnecting with the sacred feminine wisdom, but finding their own creativity and stepping into their own intuition to follow their own unique path.
Mm. Great question, because I wanted to respond to your comment to what I said, which is that when we have to step into the mystery, I mean, you mentioned that it takes a lot of courage, which I agree, but I also want to say a little bit more about what that quality or courage is. Because I suppose, there sometimes can be this assumption that courage simply means stepping out and bravely venturing into the unknown. But the root word of courage is cœur from French, and it really means heart. And I truly believe,
Mm,
because that was what was my experience, was that so long as your heart is in something,
mm, mm.
you don't actually have to summon up courage.
Ah,
You don't actually have to
beautifully
like
said.
do something brave. It's not so much about doing, but being. And being is very much the feminine principle that I also share. That the more I felt into my heart, into the truth of who I am, like I just couldn't say no anymore. And there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of resistance. I've shared some of that with you. But ultimately, I do feel that when your heart is there, um, one of my favorite books is Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, and I bring that up very often. But there is this beautiful quote that goes along the lines of, when you set your heart on something, the whole universe will conspire to help you.
Mm,
So I do want to add that for anyone who's listening and feeling fear or feeling that they can't do it, that it's not for them, I do want to share that as somebody who has experienced a lot of fear and resistance, all I knew was that I just kept sitting with what my heart was calling me to do and just kept aspiring and setting out this intention, this prayer out to the universe. And then things just started to fall into place. I found myself saying yes to a lot of things that my rational mind would have said no to. And it did take some courage to say yes when sometimes, um, situations at work would actually dismiss it, or I myself would doubt my own choices. But I believe that so long as you stay aligned, and thank you for bringing up that idea of alignment, because when I think of alignment, I'm really talking about alignment to our true nature, who we really truly are at the core. So when we align to that, it no longer matters what is going on in the world around us. It no longer matters how much noise there is, because then we stay anchored and centered in the unshakable truth of who we are.
mm.
So, yeah, I wanted to
Beautifully
speak to
said.
that.
Beautifully said. And I think I know we're going to get back to your work, but just to follow up on this, Irene, it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of living from the heart and the importance of being true to your inner self,
Yeah.
your soul self. And it feels like, and I know your background is in literature and you love story, and you're talking about the heroine's journey, which is
Mm,
different than the hero's journey. And
mm.
do you have a deeper sense of how the heroine's journey unfolds in a way that is different than what we see as the hero's journey?
Yeah. And I'm just thinking right away, I'm thinking of the story of Venus and Inanna. So, for anyone who's interested in exploring what the heroine's journey entails and how it's different from what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, I feel that the myth and the story of Inanna is a very interesting one because it's all about the descent, the ascent, but also the surrender.
Mm,
Um, and there's so much metaphor and symbolism in that I won't go through. But I mean, astrologically speaking, as you know, there's this beautiful rose spiral pattern that Venus takes. And the feminine is very much cyclical and circular. So I love just looking at that image alone, at how integral it is and how um, beautiful the sacred geometry that is created is when Venus goes through that cycle of when it shifts from being the evening star to the morning star. It's very much, I feel, resonating with the feminine principle where there is the dark, the mystery, the hidden, and then there is the light and the shining and the expansion. That I feel that the hero's journey doesn't always highlight.
mm,
Yeah, and I also feel called to share. And this sort of spirals back to the earlier question that you had asked me. So I spoke about the heart and I spoke about saying yes. And one of the things that I said yes to that I had resistance to for the longest time was receiving coaching, because I think for so long I've tried to do it on my own to be independent. I signed up for tons of training, got qualifications, etc. But it wasn't until I invested, or rather I'll say I gifted myself with a coach who is still with me today, that gave me the most transformational experience and enabled me to be where I am today. And when I think about it, the feminine is very relational. I don't think I could have done this alone if I hadn't had a guide to not so much point the way, but to just be with me, to witness my process and to hold space for me. Again, I feel that is a very feminine principle. There tends to be a lot of advice giving. I think that's more for mentoring, but there isn't that allowance of one's inner truth to take time to be seeded,
Mm.
to blossom and to grow. And so I really see coaching as a form of sacred service. But coaching in itself, it's one of the most unregulated industries out there. It's also very fast growing. So I feel that there are a lot of misconceptions about coaching. I know that for me personally, it wasn't until I experienced it for myself, and I have a really good coach who walks the feminine path that transformed my life. And that's actually why I shifted. And now the main form of work that I do that I feel is of most value is as a one-to-one coach. And coincidentally, or rather synchronistically, my coach was a former school teacher as well. And when I'd gone to
Interesting.
her for coaching, it wasn't for business and it wasn't for career. It was for my personal life. I was undergoing a crisis at the time. And I remember thinking, all the modalities that I've picked out, all the meditation that I've done, all the retreats that I've gone for, somehow, when I was facing this very human, personal crisis in my life, none of that seemed to support me. And I realized that I really needed that one-on-one guidance. And I think I've shared some of this with you before, Heather. So for the audience, or for the audience's benefit, when I named my company Alignment Journeys, I had very much a travel metaphor in mind. And so for anyone who's familiar and has gone to a travel agency before, there are group tours that you can join that is fun and gives you the whole package, but it may not specifically target everything that you're interested in. Whereas having a one-to-one guide provides that for you, and you end up having a richer experience and a more fulfilling and meaningful journey. So that's how I see myself now. There are all these titles and positions, but I think at the core of it, I see myself as a guide who helps the women that I serve journey through and explore the inner terrain and the landscape of their soul. I think that gives me the biggest joy and fulfillment today.
Oh, beautiful, Irene. And I love your understanding of coaching as not about advice giving or focusing on what the person is doing and how to be successful in that sense, but to do that deep inner work and align with the true self. And I know part of your gift is your empathic attunement and your capacity to see the essence of who someone is and mirror that back to support them in seeing and knowing and being in their true self, which is profound work. And going back a minute, I love what I as you well know, I love that understanding of the myth of Inanna and the heroine's journey. In fact, the class I'm teaching on Saturday is about the Mars journey versus the Venus journey. And one of the things that's important in that story of the Venus cycle and the myth of Inanna is Inanna had a companion with her on the journey, Ninchabar, who went with her, held space for her, supported her in her journey. And so Inanna was in that ongoing relationship with someone who could be there with her, for her, as she did that journey into the underworld, letting go of her identity as she'd known it, going through this transformation and rebirth. She had someone holding the space for her. And
Mm,
you are doing that ninja bar work, which is really beautiful. And I think part of what you're also saying that's so important is the heroine's journey is about going deep within, coming into that right relationship with ourselves in order to step out in the world, in order to come out of the underworld back into this realm in a way that we are being true to who we are. And that emphasis on being, not doing. So it seems like that is so much at the core of your own process and then what you're offering to other women. But
mm,
you also weave in a healing piece. And you and I were talking about this before, and I've looked at all the trainings you've done. Oh my goodness, the modalities that you have training in that you weave into your work, from the emotional freedom technique, Reiki, internal family systems, NLP, Aikido, Kundalini yoga. You've done so much in terms of your own exploration of healing. And how do you weave that into your work with women in terms of the importance of that healing process to step into our true selves?
mm. Yeah. Thank you, Heather, for everything that you said. I found it very moving, many pieces to it. But to answer your question, I think what I would like to say most is that, first and foremost, is that I really enjoy connecting the dots. I think that is a personal passion of mine. And so I really enjoy studying and researching different modalities, because even though they have different names and they seem different, but there is a universality that connects all of them. And I'm thinking again to that beautiful spiral path that Venus takes, and at the center there's that five-pointed star, that if you think of it as a rose, so a lot of people describe the path of Venus as the rose path. And I was initiated as a priestess of the rose. So there's that whole idea of, at the center of who we are is this beautiful flower that just yearns to naturally bloom and to blossom and to shine. And the whole path for us to get there, it's circular. And that's why I don't really call myself a business coach. I don't call myself a relationship coach, because, you know, the personal is the political. And what we do in our personal life, the work that we do, it cannot but have a spillover effect onto every aspect of our lives. So I feel that in the service that I offer to the women that I work with, regardless of what aspect that they are currently facing, whatever issue that they want to work on, it's going to have an effect, a
Mhm.
spillover effect on everything else. So that was very much my journey and my experience, where, for example, by learning about Aikido, and I picked that up because I love the philosophy of nonviolence, and yet the importance of standing up for myself. I did come from a family where there was a lot of physical and psychological abuse. So I knew that one of the things that, as an adult, I wanted to be able to do was to protect and to defend myself. And but I was also very anti-violence, and it's very hard for me to watch violence. So for example, I remember my first experience at the dojo when I went on the mat. I had this inexplicable fear that I would die. And all my sensei wanted to teach me at the time was how to roll. But because I had so much trauma that I carried in my body, it was very
Mhm.
difficult. But at the time, I was also practicing Reiki, which is a form of energy healing. And so I was feeling into how Aikido as a martial arts and how Reiki as an energy healing modality, um, both of which technically originate from Japan, but they're not exclusive to Japan. Because a lot of people in the Reiki field would say that it's actually just energy. And it was a specific Buddhist monk who landed and called it Reiki, but there are different forms of energy healing as well. But just to say that when I felt into these two modalities and I was practicing it on the mat in the physical world, training and moving my body, whereas for Reiki, most of the time you're either lying or sitting in stillness. But I was feeling into how when I integrate both modalities together, there is this beautiful new field that is created. So that's what excites me. Even in my major in literature, I loved bringing in science and psychology and seeing what new possibilities would emerge. So I feel that it is because of this personal interest, wanting to play with possibilities, that got me on this journey to pick up all these different modalities. And when I work with my clients, it's very much a tuning into their energy and sensing where they are coming from, where they're at. So it's not about, hi, I have all this and I'm going to throw it at you. It's about seeing what they need and meeting them where they're at. I also want to add that when you mentioned and you mirrored that back to me about my empathic gifts, it moved me on a very deep level, because what I will share is that I hated it for so long, especially when I was a child, and I didn't understand the gifts that came with it. Because, at the same time, there were a lot of challenges in absorbing and picking up on other people's energies. I feel like in some way I passed a test where I went through a process of desensitization and disassociation because of trauma in my younger years. And then I went on this healing journey to reclaim my sensitivities. And I feel that a lot of women actually, when they awaken to their sacred feminine, their sensitivity comes back online. But then it often becomes a very overwhelming process of trying to be comfortable with being sensitive in a world that actually can feel very safe and very insensitive at times. And this is why I needed my coach to journey together along with me and guide me along my process.
So much to follow up on here. This is so powerful, because part of what you're talking about is that I think is important is if we as women are reclaiming that sensitivity, and for men, that sacred feminine within them to reclaim that sensitivity, it can be very hard in a world that can feel so insensitive and unsafe. And I think, as you're saying, it makes it important not only to have a coach or have that supportive relationship or relationships in our lives to support us in being in our true nature in a world that can be very harsh, but the importance of finding our soul tribe to really be connecting with those who are trying to create new ways of being on the planet that are not about that patriarchal model of conflict, competition, power over, separation, but are about relationship, being sensitive, being true to ourselves, being in right relationship with each other. So this feels like a huge piece of the work that you're describing.
Yeah, and can I speak into that a bit more? Because when I was tuning into what it was that I wanted to offer, it was the 3 C's that came up. So that's coaching, that's one-on-one private. So you have that safe container and that secret space that's held. And then the second C is courses. I feel that there needs to be an education, a re-education of sorts that needs to take place. And then the third piece is community. So one of the things that I do offer also is to hold women's circles, because I feel that
Mhm.
the community piece, especially this year in 2024, when I tuned into what it was that I wanted to really highlight, was this sense of bringing together a soul tribe. And it feels like a bit of a marketing spiel, but I can only sell what I truly believe in, which is that I believe that every woman should have a coach and that every woman should have a community that she belongs to and has that sense of, when I say belonging, it's a true soul belonging, not because of hobbies or interests, but because of, the energetics of our soul connection. I feel that that piece is really important, especially as we are moving so well and truly into the Aquarian age.
And that is so much an important theme in the Aquarian age is coming back into community, into connection, into collaboration, to co-create together. So, and it is about, I mean, that is part of the beauty, as you were saying, of moving into these new paradigms that aren't about going back into the past, but moving into new ways of being that are about community, but also honoring our own unique creativity, our own unique expression, our own unique gifts. So you're really holding the both and in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you mentioned that because I know that earlier on we were chatting a little bit about the travels that I was doing and the journeys that I was taking. So a lot of the work, the main bulk of my work that I'm offering now is online because I'm also feeling into the Aquarian age and how technology and the virtual world is becoming a real reality. And I don't feel that it's about resisting what is coming, but it's about using it with integrity. So I
Mm.
know that for myself, when I was growing up, the physical environment that I was a part of was almost antithetical to my innate way of being. And it wasn't until I found community online or when I was traveling and I was finding community in other parts of the world, but it was not a permanent home for me. So it was temporary. And I'm really glad I had that physical face-to-face connection. But I'm also feeling that in this day and age, it's that global interconnected community that we are really co-creating together. So that is also what called me to um, to go full force into my online business instead of doing it only in person. Yeah.
Like you're saying, part of what you're doing is creating this community that is cross-cultural too by being
Mhm.
virtual.
Yeah.
And you,
Yeah.
in your own journey, have been exposed to different cultural contexts and how you're weaving that in your own sense of yourself. I mean, we were talking a little bit about, just the intensity of growing up in the cultural context in Singapore, and then how part of your journey of having space to explore and discover yourself ended up being spending time in Mexico, such a different cultural context. And now you're temporarily in Thailand. So it seems like part of your journey has also been finding your own sense of self in the midst of different cultural contexts.
And I feel that a lot of that is guided by, I feel very fortunate and blessed to be able to physically travel and to experience different cultures. Um, and to me, it's a real privilege. Like I don't take it for granted that I'm able to do that. Um, what I find also interesting is that ancestrally, in my DNA, that's from China, but I was born and raised in a country that's often seen as a hodgepodge or a melting pot of cultures, that is Singapore. And that's why I grew up with both a very strong Western background and a very strong Eastern heritage. And part of my personal journey as well has been to integrate, to find what really works for me. Because, uh, and especially right now in the global stage, there is a narrative being put forth. Um, and I know you speak a lot about this, about the ongoing polarities and I would say, the stories that are being crafted of us against them, of the other. But that's not going to work if you're going to move into the Aquarian age where you see every other human being as a brother or a sister. And you've got to remove that antagonism. For me, it was very much the internal conflict, that internal antagonism that I was facing inside. And until I sorted that out, my external world would reflect that turbulence back to me. So it wasn't until I could find a place that I was at peace and in balance inside of myself that my external reality began to change. And I know you speak a lot about this, right? The field that we are all co-weaving together. So there's the inner and the outer, and then there is also the person, the individual, and the collective. So the idea of both and really comes into play here.
Which circles back to something you were saying a few minutes ago that I think is really profound, where you were talking about some of your journey with Aikido and Reiki being honoring the inner stillness, but then moving into movement. And it feels like part of what you're saying is the importance of doing that inner work to be in alignment with our true self, with our soul self, and then to allow our movement and our interfacing with the world or whatever's going on around us to come from that inner alignment, that inner knowing, and that inner stillness. Would that be accurate?
I have an interesting story about this because a huge part of the conflict that I had faced, which is relevant, although not directly relevant to the example that you gave, there is that piece, of course, of stillness and movement. But the story that came to mind was, when I first started joining spiritual communities and enrolling in practices, back then, there was a lot of talk about getting out of your mind, stepping out of the mind. There was a lot of criticism and judgment about how we shouldn't just be thinking, that we should experience from a different sense. And so at that time, a lot of emphasis was placed on, for example, going into a different space in meditation, which I can see the value in that. But as somebody who has a very strong mind, I can't help but think. So telling me not to think was telling me to go against the grain of who I am. And I really struggled with this for a long time. I felt really inadequate when I was asking questions, when I was raising questions about certain experiences I was having in meditative spaces. And I would be just told, quite sternly at times, you're thinking too much. And the thing was, I couldn't stop thinking. I have a mind that is constantly thinking. So until I found a way to work with my mind and not against it, and I learned to integrate the left and the right brain, which is the language that you use a lot, until I could really trust that this is my process. I was facing a lot of conflict because I struggled and I really, really tried to be that person that would meditate and not think. I feel that now there's a more comprehensive and holistic understanding of what meditation is. It does not mean that you don't think. It just simply means that when the thoughts arise, you know how to meet and face them and hold them there while still being in that meditative realm. So again, it's about that blend and that integration. And it's the same with stillness and movement. Can you, like when we're sitting in stillness, even if our physical body is not moving a lot, there actually is a lot going on internally. And similarly, oftentimes, for people who are very kinesthetic in nature, specifically, right, they find that meditation in movement helps. So when they're moving, that's actually when they find a lot of internal stillness. So because I've had all these different experiences, when I work with my clients, I can see what works for them and what may not necessarily work. And then we can look at co-creating, because it is a collaborative process. Co-creating a program and a way of being that works for them, instead of like listening to the guru or the spiritual instructor who may be really expert and may be a really great authority in his or her field. but may not necessarily understand that as diverse beings, we come with a whole spectrum of experiences and gifts. And I do feel that the process of inner alignment and self-actualization, the actualization of your soul potential, is really to look at the gifts that you came incarnated with. And this is where I would share that astrology had a huge impact on my life, because when I began to understand more of who I was, who I am, through the language of astrology, of looking at my chart, it felt like I was reading a book or a map
Mm.
that was specifically for me and not for anybody else. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. I've actually forgotten where we were.
Absolutely. That's beautiful, Irene. And just following up on that last point, yes, I so deeply believe that our chart gives us that blueprint or that key to understanding what our soul self's intentions were in this lifetime and
Mm,
how to connect with those themes and those gifts and those intentions to be coming back to center, to be living from the true self. So that's beautiful how you're describing that. And also your understanding of the importance as we're moving into the Aquarian age of getting out of that power over dynamic, even if it comes to healing modalities or coaching modalities or ways of learning spiritual meditation practices, that we have to get out of that paradigm of power over and come back into that understanding of how to be collaborative with each other. And again, part of what I really respect in your work is your deep commitment to being a companion with someone on their journey in their own discovery of their uniqueness and how to work with these different healing modalities or approaches to be in their true self, not to adapt to some other modality or way of being. That's
mm.
powerful.
I really like your use of the word companion, because that carries an intimacy to it. Just
Mhm.
that it's not a job title that I can put on my website. If you get my drift, I
Yeah.
can't say that I work as a companion. I think that would have a whole different connotation. But yes, I think the level of intimacy that comes with getting a coach or whatever word you want to use to be with you on your personal journey. I do feel that it's truly like a priceless gift. Um, and I'm very grateful to have had that in my life. Um, and I do feel that this is in some way my way of giving back to say thanks to the universe for what I've received.
Beautiful. And also, Irene, I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying about the importance as we're moving into the Aquarian age of reweaving left brain, right brain ways of thinking and being. And I know that's very strong in your chart. And you really emphasize that in your work of you've come out of this very you and I were talking before about the high level of the educational process in Singapore in its comparison with educational systems around the world. And yet the intensity of that left brain approach
Mm,
versus so much of what you've been reweaving in your own life and in your work is supporting others in honoring their intuition and honoring those more right brain integrative ways of thinking and being and
mm,
finding that balance that's so much also a part of the Aquarian paradigm.
yeah, that really speaks to me because what I'm getting is that I mean, there's a lot of criticism, some of it well justified, about current education. Well, I'm talking about the conventional education system. But my personal take on it is that it's not all bad. And it's not about, again, it's not about one is better than the other. I do feel that there are limitations given the history of why education was made for the masses in the first place. It was in large part due to the Industrial Revolution, and you have that idea of preparing the masses or workers to work in factories. And unfortunately, some of that is still with us today, even though we've moved out of the industrial age. It's just that I think education being quite a bulky system, because it is so large, hasn't quite caught up with that yet. And that was why I left the conventional education system. But I still firmly believe that education is the way to go. I see that very much as part of the Aquarian age, actually, that it's the collective, and that education is a force for knowledge and for good. So at the essence of it, I just feel that the right brain ways of learning and seeing things, as you've put it, needs to be brought back. It's sort of like having two hands and learning to be ambidextrous. Personally, I feel very privileged because I've had really privileged experiences in some of the top schools in Singapore where I really honed and refined my left brain thinking. So I'm very grateful for that. And I realized that part of my journey was simply bringing my right brain ways of thinking back online, and then now sharing it with my community. It's as simple as that. So, a lot of times revolution tends to be bloody and violent, but I feel that creative destruction doesn't necessarily have to tear down everything. And again, I think this speaks very much to the Aquarian age. It's not about pulling old structures down. It's about creating new ones and then forging a new path. It's about, the equation 1 + 1 = 3. So it's that creative possibility that I feel is already emerging when I tune into what the collective space is already birthing. And I feel enormously grateful and excited to be a part of that creative process.
This is just, so insightful in what you're saying, Irene, because you're really talking about not getting caught in polarization, but to hold the both and, that we're not tearing down and letting go of what has been valuable. We're just letting go of what's been out of balance and coming into a new creation, a co-creation that's integrating the polarities into wholeness again and bringing things back into balance, which is so much the theme of the Aquarian age. This is beautiful how you're doing that in your own inner process and then supporting others and how they can do it in a way that's honoring their true self and then being part of the co-creation in community with what we're moving into with the Aquarian age. Before we stop, is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of your process?
Yeah, what I wanted to speak into after your reflection was that for a huge part of my younger life, I was focusing on the external. I was focusing on what society was telling me was success, right? The external achievements. So I was performing, although I don't mean that in a negative sense. It was just like, okay, I was trained in something and I learned to excel in it. But it was very much external. And I feel now with the Aquarian age, because even though it is about the collective and the humanitarian collective, if you will, there is still that inner piece that's vital. And of course, as you're aware of, at the opposite end of Aquarius is Leo, which is about outshining our inner child, our sun, and I think back on, well, I'm specifically thinking back to some of the things that we said earlier in this call, and that piece about, because you mentioned IFS, my coach has used a lot of IFS with me, so I'm aware, and then I trained in the modality. There's our inner child, there are the exiles and the managers, and it's about integrating all these parts, that no part is bad. But it's interesting because for much of the time, before the language of IFS became so popular, there was a lot of, in therapy, they were talking about, for example, your parents, people in your outside world. But really, the inner and the outer, they go hand in hand. And until I learned to work with my inner parts, and what got me to realize is that this is where we have the most agency and the most sovereignty. And again, with the Aquarian age, if we bring in the Leo element, the empowered queen and king of our life, of our universe, I envision a world where everyone in the collective is their own authority and is their own sovereign. And they're working, collaborating with each other. There's no ego, there's no competition, but it's about everybody rising and shining brighter than ever. And so that's my vision of the Aquarian age. And so I really wanted to speak into that. But before we can even step into the Aquarian age, we have to come back to ourselves first and foremost. And so that to me is what alignment journeys is all about. When we align with our inner vision, our inner calling, then the outside world, we don't have to worry about trying to change or control or make the world a better place. I know that there's a lot of activism that is emerging as well, but I feel that it has to start first and foremost with ourselves, with the inner. I've definitely been on that journey of trying to change my outer world without first realizing that I have to work on my inner self. So I think that's the piece that I would like to leave your audience with.
So much richness in what you're saying, Irene. And just to follow up on that, I think you're really talking about how when we align with that inner self, and so much of my writing is about how the chart is like a medicine wheel. And as we honor all those facets of ourselves and all those parts within us, but come to center, come to that place of integrating the wholeness of the multiplicity of who we are, then we're living from our true gifts. And we are, as you said earlier, then in harmony with the energies of the cosmos to be living out our unique gifts in collaboration and co-creation with each other and with cosmic consciousness. And that is what allows a new world to emerge and how we can co-create these new ways of being together. And you're really speaking to that and you're living that. So thank you for just the profound inner journey you've been on and how you're finding that alignment with your true self to be supporting others and women in particular to come into their true selves and to be emanating that in the world in this time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you who are listening, who are also on this path, and for the ways we are supporting each other in being true to ourselves and co-creating a new world together. So thank you.